You either live by the gun or you die by the sword.
Welcome to the Good, the Bad, and the Weird MicroViews. I'm Nicho.
And I'm Chris.
And I have been excited for this year because we kind of planned this just last year.
We did.
We are doing a light kickoff to Folktober, and if the movies we're talking about don't give it away...
I mean, I'm sure they will.
We're doing Japan this year.
Yes, as far as like a narrowing down of folk. Because when we were talking about it, we realized that folk is just too damn big of a topic.
Mm-hmm.
There's too many places that have too variety of folk to cover in a broad sweep. So we wanted to dig in, and honestly, we picked Japan because it's honestly one of the more accessible ones to do.
Accessible, and the ones that we're a bit more familiar with, which at the same time is very difficult to do because, and we'll get into it a little bit more later on, but Japanese folklore is so, it's a hodgepodge of multiple beliefs that are so ancient within the country itself and without it that it's hard to, like, as a society that is heavily singular religious based, Japan's religion is fused between like 3 different religions, where you've got Shintoism, which is very difficult in itself to try and express as a whole. You got Buddhism, and then you also have like Chinese yin yang sorcery.
Definitely. I also think that while folk is something that is becoming more and more interested in media in general, especially, let's be honest, more European folk, especially like English, Irish, Scottish, Germanic. Japan beat us all here with their movies, so that's where we're going to start, because a lot of these we either already knew a great deal about, we're already interested in, or we already owned, which does help quite a bit. Yeah.
And so in this pregame of Folktober, we are doing mythology and legends adjacent movies to Folktober for the month of September. And starting that off, we chose a little bit of a ballsy move on this part.
Yes.
We're doing Pom Poko.
Honestly, one of my favorites. I know we'd already covered Ghibli, so I didn't expect us to do like a big deep dive on this movie, so I am so happy we could fit it in somewhere. This is one of my favorites, but it is one of those odd favorites. Unlike a lot of other Ghibli movies that, like, you can really just kind of offhandedly advise anyone to watch, this one always comes with a giant trigger asterisk warning.
I wouldn't even give it that, because, like, it's very minimal. Like, honestly...
It is done perfectly.
Yeah, it's done perfectly, but the balls are, like, such a small part of the entire movie, but that's what everyone talks about is, oh, it's the raccoon balls.
Yes, and that's why it comes with a little bit of an asterisk, because while a lot of other Ghibli stuff, while the studio in general does incorporate a lot of, like, folk-adjacent bits into their movies, and I think that's where a lot of people get first introduced to a lot of the big concepts of Japanese folk, Pom Poko does so in a much more Japanese-friendly as opposed to Western-friendly way.
Yeah.
You are meant to already know what these little creatures are and how they sort of kind of operate.
Yes, and I'll get into why that is in just a little bit. So, Pom Poko, written and directed by Isao Takahata. Pom Poko follows a group of tanuki or raccoon dogs who struggle to save their home as urban development encroaches upon them in the economic boom of the Japanese 60s.
Yes.
Voiced by Makoto Nanomura as Shochiki. This is his only role that's recognizable to us Americans.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Shigeru Izumiya as Gonta, who is also in Godzilla Final Wars, and as Kuronuma in Burst City, and the later Japanese cyberpunk flick, Death Powder.
Very good.
Nijiki Kiyokawa as Fireball Oroku, who has an impressive 305 acting credits, with probably the one people could find and pull out most easily for us Americans is she has a very small role in Gamera 3 Revenge of Iris.
300, damn, that's impressive.
Yeah, a lot. She was acting since like the 40s or something.
Oh, hot damn.
Yeah, she's been around. As well as Yuriko Ishida as Okio, who has been in a couple other Studio Ghibli films herself, most probably well known as Mononoke Hime and Princess Mononoke.
Another fantastic movie.
Yep, as well as Miki from Up on Poppy Hill.
Another good one.
As well, she has been in a lot of live actions, including Beat Takashi's Boiling Point, which is one of the big movies in the gun fu movement,
Mm-hmm.
and she's in the live-action movie adaptation of Erased.
Wow, very fun.
Yeah. And we do have a lot of sources starting off with this series.
Yes.
From this MicroView throughout, so I'll probably repeat them for a couple episodes, but the sources for this series are The Book of Yokai by Michael Dillon Foster, Japandemonium Illustrated, the Yokai Encyclopedium of Toriyama Sekian, the translated and annotated by Hiroko Yoda and Matt Alt, interview series Hiding in Plain Sight, A Brief History of Yokai, the Yanagita Kunio Guide to Japanese Folktale, translated and edited by Fanny Hagen-Meyer. Ancient Times in Modern Japan, an anthology of Japanese folktales, selected and translated by Fanny Hagen-Meyer. Japanese Tales, edited and translated by Royal Tyler. Nihongi, Chronicles of Japan from earliest times to AD 697, translated by William George Aston. As well as, when we've needed it at times, yokai.com.
Honestly, a solid resource.
It is, especially for some of the ones that you can't find, which I'll get into that just a little bit because I do want to discuss what is a tanuki.
Sure, because honestly, that is the main question and sticking point for this film in general. Having a baseline understanding, unlike most other Ghibli films, really does help if you're going to be watching this for the first time.
Yes. So, also known as raccoon dogs, it is a common creature in Japanese folklore and yokai, similar to other spirits or creatures such as kitsune or trickster foxes, as well as the lesser-known Mujina or Japanese badger that shows up. Mujina was actually, its term changed later on, because we see a Mujina in this as the faceless creatures, but that's also something that was transformed with Lafcadio Hearn's Quaidan.
Gotcha.
As well as tenor martens or kawaso or otters. So there's a lot of transforming creatures, but of the many, tanuki are about as famous as the kitsune or trickster foxes. But unlike kitsune, tanuki are more playful, and many of the legends end in their deaths because they're kind of clumsy and a little bit stupid.
Yeah, and from what I have read about the actual raccoon dogs, much like raccoons here in the US, while they are not related, they are not raccoons, and raccoon dogs, they are not the same species at all. Both tend to have a habit of getting themselves into trouble, like dumpster diving and not getting back out. So it does track that they would be playful, but a little bit stupid.
Yep. And the specific transforming variation is also known as Bake Danuki.
Ah.
Which that's the thing is, not all tanuki are able to transform, and same with kitsune. Not kitsune are foxes, but all foxes aren't transforming kitsune.
There you go.
Yeah.
It's circles and squares.
Yeah. And like I said, they're one of the oldest creatures in Japanese folklore, or one of the older ones, appearing first in 697's Nihonji, which is why Toriyama Sekian didn't write any description of them in Gazu Hyaki Yagyo Injo, or the illustrated Demon Horde Night Parade Yin, Volume 1, as a collection was of well-known yokai.
Gotcha.
So there's a lot that don't have translations to it, and so if you pick up Japandemonium, there's annotations along with it to help us understand as Westerners where these things are coming from, but the original scrolls or the original writings don't have any description.
Makes sense. The other part, which is a little less rooted in the old legend, especially for this movie, is the shape-shifting goes to all parts, and the balls, being a hilarious little anecdote, is part of it. The statues are often overly well endowed with balls. It is not an uncommon, and it is not an unkid-friendly thing, which is why this is still a kids movie, and it is still recommended as a kids movie. It's just one of those things that if you are brand new to Ghibli and you've somehow missed Pom Poko, it's something to know going in that you're not getting set up for something weird. It just is. Yes.
And on top of that, the actual testicle transformation ones came later on, then they were known as the Kinu Tanuki or the Silken Tanuki, something that we owe tribute to the ukiyo-e artists that popularized yokai in the Edo era.
Sure. I think it just is one of those things that, as art changes throughout time, different aspects of real-life nature end up in paintings. Currently, we are seeing that with buttholes and balls being put on cats. Cats always have had buttholes and balls, but we've not always drawn them with them. Usually they are removed for our sensibilities. But recently people have found that hilarious, so they're back on.
Yeah.
So a lot of this has to do with like a similar fashion. Like at some point someone thought, real life raccoon dogs, they have balls. It was very funny. It was hilarious. Put them back on. And so they just kind of kept going.
I guess.
It's just how art be, especially with animals.
Oh, yeah. And I mean, that's part of the thing, too, is, like, especially with everything changing. I know at one point in Edo, the emperor tried removing Buddhism from the culture, but it was so integrated at that point, because it's been there for over 1,000 years. So
it's hard to erase that.
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, they didn't have the chisel power that the Roman Church had with their whole attempt, so I get it. It's a little harder to erase.
Yeah. Getting into Pom Poko, though.
Yes.
What I really like is that from the beginning, there is a good setup of education on the tanuki itself, where it feels almost documentary-like, where it's old-timey, where you get the little kind of children's rhyme, where it's almost a setup to like a children's educational show that happens to be a cartoon and wants to talk about urbanism.
Yes. Oh, 100%. I also really like that it starts from the beginning, setting up not only the tanuki, but the natural, like, greenish movement that Japan was going through during the 80s and the 90s. So this was a topic that, like, having in a kid's movie was not unheard of. We went through a very similar phase in the 90s here in the US. Mm-hmm. Several of Ghibli's films are nature-based as far as, like, reviving or protecting. So I like that it sets it up, unlike the other ones, which are leaned more a little bit towards adults, especially Princess Mononoke, with its messages being a little bit harder to understand and a little bit more rounded and complex.
And a little scarier, too.
Definitely. This one sets it up in a much more kid-friendly and understandable way, where there's a clear bad guy and a clear good guy, on at least who we should be rooting for.
No, exactly. And even the way they set it up, too, where the tanuki take over the old farmhouse, it's setting up Japan as we would think of it more historically pre-industrialization, where it's a bunch of farmland and the tanuki are kind of living at peace with people, but we learn that they kind of grow, their nature's being erased as well as the old ways, and the tanuki are 100% set up or stuck in their old ways, because even as their land's being taken away, their showdowns are still in the old samurai style battle or those types of movies.
Oh, definitely. And this would have been like a very like well understood concept at the time, even for children. The 60s saw a huge boom in Japan, especially moving out of Tokyo. It was one of the first times that Tokyo saw a net loss as far as population. Mm-hmm. And so building out the suburbia of Tokyo was a big thing. And then in the 80s and the 90s, the government went, oh shit, we've really fucked ourselves here a little bit. So there was a big tree planting reforestation project that saw a huge increase in trees, somewhere around like the 40-ish% increase, which is gigantic. Mm-hmm. There was also a huge shift to import wood as opposed to use Japanese local wood for a lot of things, because they were running out of old timber, especially for rebuilding some stuff, because unfortunately Japan is not a super, like, they have a lot of earthquakes, they have a lot of tsunamis, things get put down. Having old timber to rebuild stuff with, especially like temples, shrines, historical monuments, was getting kind of hard to find.
Yeah, it's not like Notre Dame, where when the first pillar or when the first spire was taken down, they kept growing the same type of wood and letting it slow grow for in case something else happened so they could replace it down the line.
Yeah, and honestly, it was partially just because they were running out of space to do that sort of stuff. The need for housing was growing so much faster, so having this program in the 80s be at a level for children was fantastic, because it also puts the tradition that the children would have been, like, well understanding as far as what the tanuki were up to, because it's all done so characterized, right? Like, yes, they play with the samurai idea, but it's in the same way that, like, movies do it, where it's not overly thought through, it's not super historical in any way, it's just, like, over-the-top characters who are still, like, these cute little creatures running around the woods in their dirty shack. Yeah,
well, it's also an early way of setting up that with the difficulties of nature adjusting to modern times, because, again, we talk about this urbanization, and we also see that influx of people moving away from the rural to the urban and having to have a much more densified or not even a suburb, a densified city block.
Yeah.
But that serious battle, like you mentioned, breaks into a comedic battle very early on, just to show the transformation skills and introduce playing on how tanuki are slightly comedic.
Yes. I also think it, from the beginning, sets up the tanuki to be frustrating to the human watchers, because the way they handle things, even from, I think, a child's point of view, while fun, it's easy to see, like, if they could just sit down and get their stuff together, they could save themselves this heartache. They could work together to get to it well before they do in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's done in such a smart way where it's not in your face, it's not leading anyone or hand-holding, but it's done in such a way that no matter who you are, you can see it very clearly.
Yeah, I think... Okay, so I'll disagree with that a little bit from in the very beginning, because it turns more comedic, more fun after, like, the very introduction.
Sure.
Because we get that cool imagery of, like, the one machine tearing across the entire side of the mountain.
Yeah, that is cool.
Yeah, we get the taming of the new town, the bulldozing of the leaves, and, like, a Buddha, and playing with the development and stuff, kind of like the gods.
Yeah.
The gods are on the human side at this point.
Sure.
And it's a nice reflection on human life on a tanuki.
True. I think it also does a good job of not showing... I mean, it definitely shows the full impact and devastation, and yet the tanuki are removed enough from it still that you can kind of understand their lenience to, like, truly act.
Mm-hmm. Well, you see that because we have that reflection on the tanuki where they're like humans, where most of them have forgotten the art of transformation, because in a more scientific world, of course, the magical creatures of days old don't always remember how to do what they were supposed to do back in the day.
Sure, and, technique lost to time.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, I mean, we also see the influence of humans on them, where they're eating human food and they're learning through TV.
I do think that is hilarious, that they're just all gathered around the tiny little TV, trying to watch anything.
Oh, yeah. No, exactly. Well, that's the thing, like, the TV is so important to them, but at other times they completely forget that the TV is even there when it's crucial, again, playing into the nature of the tanuki in the old story tales where
Sure.
they kind of screw up. Like, there's the one story of some saint up or some priest up in the mountains who says he claims to see Buddha appears to him, and he tells this to a mountaineer, and then the mountaineer sees it, and he's like, well, why would I, someone who kill animals for a living, be able to see a Buddha?
True.
And so he shoots it, and it turns out to be a tanuki. Again, that's the kind of stories that tanukis are based on, where, yeah, they can transform and trick people, and it's always something playful, and they still end up dying, because even regardless of how hard they're trying.
That's true. I also think that the way that they're portrayed is a very nice personification of them, too. They're not so human-like that all of them are easily, like, agreeable or even logical at times. They maintain that level of animal, like, thought process at times where, like, they have problem-solving skills, but they're so easily distracted. They're so easy to, like, get off task. They're just out here for fun, or they're interested in food. Yeah,
Gonta tries doing a coup, and he's quickly shot down, like, not even, like, 3 seconds into his coup.
Yeah, exactly.
Or they're told, don't breed, and then the next season they're like, oh, well, we got it. We can't hold it anymore.
Yeah, exactly. There's like, well, too late. And it's not even like, oh, oopsie. It's like they have a full courting ritual where they're handing out flowers to girls that they like. It's like, guys, you didn't try that hard.
No, exactly. Well, they tried. They tried enough.
They tried by tanuki standards.
Exactly. But I also think it's interesting the way they go about teaching the tanuki, as well as we learn about the lore of them ourselves within the movie. Because we learn about history, we learn about lore, and we learn about the evolution or the impact of humans upon nature.
True.
But we also get expanding where we learn about that, hey, they not all can transform, like the foxes as well. Like I talked about earlier, the kitsune can transform. But I also appreciate that they make that big distinction between the tanuki and the kitsune, where the tanuki are always bumbling, but when we do finally see kitsune in this, that they are the ones that are cunning. They're the ones who have kind of survived, but not fully.
They've survived, they have not thrived.
No, exactly. Yeah. And that's the biggest part of that, is that the survival, not thriving.
Yes.
Also, how easily they're tricked even by their own people, by like the childhood nursery rhymes.
Yes, they're so cute.
Oh, it's adorable. But I mean, I get it is hard to break habits. I mean, I feel and kind of look a little bit like the tanuki in these movies. I got the saggy eyes. I live off of like an energy drink a day, and I'm a tad chubby.
I mean, especially towards the end of the movie, where they're showing them trying to pretend to live as humans because they feel like their land is gone, there's nowhere for them to go to, so they're trying their best to just pretend to be humans, and they cannot keep up with the rat race at all. They're out here just living off of energy drinks and ramen as best they can.
Oh, no, exactly. And that's the thing is they are kind of adapting, but they're not adapting as well as some of the others.
No, it's clear that, the other animals that can transform, like the foxes are outsmarting they're becoming CEOs, so they've got excuses to be absent at times. They let other people run the show for them pretty much and just collect all the reward. And the tanuki gets kind of stuck with, like, these low-level jobs of being, like, shop clerks and stuff, where, like, they're not even suited to it.
Nope.
But they didn't think that through, and they're not clever enough for, like, tricking at anything else.
No, exactly. And, I mean, that's the thing is, like, they send 3 off on a whole journey to actually figure out how we're going to fix this. And some of them come back and don't have it. But I also appreciate that while they're out searching, all the land that's being dumped is disturbing another group of tanukis who sent someone out else to find, hey, where's the issue? And I think that's what's interesting about that is it sets up this world that, hey, we have the human world, but the tanukis are also part of that world where we find out that one of the other shrines, the tanukis are doing well because they've done the exact same thing that the kitsune do, is they're just impersonating the more fearful spirit. Because that's the thing is, like, kitsune, while trickster spirits usually aren't harmful to humans until, like, invoked or acted upon. Like, there's a story, one of the famous ones that's appeared in, like, multiple of the books I've read, of a samurai shoots a kitsune in the tail, and then as he's returning home, he sees it across the bridge with a torch in its mouth, and as he goes to catch it, it lights his house on fire.
That's bad.
Exactly. So they're using the kitsune's tactics in a different manner than how the kitsune have evolved.
Yes, and I think while a lot of Ghibli films show this interaction between nature and people really well, this one I think does the best at trying to show how it's bigger than just nature as a big conglomerate idea. Especially when you start to look at their, like, night parade that they do to try and scare everyone away.
Yes.
Because it is a good idea, but at, like, a very low level. And I think this is a great, like, entry level where it's not so dumb that, like, it feels pandery, but it's dumb enough that an adult would go, well, I don't know if that would work, but a kid would go, no, this is a good idea. And then once they see the consequences of how, like, this over-the-top display getting mistaken or rebranded as advertisement.
Well, here's what it is too. So it's a return to the classic story of tanukis.
True.
Where while successful for a little bit, they bumble it up still.
True.
Because, I mean, they do a good job of scaring the people, and, like, they play off a lot of classic Japanese folklore and other yokai.
True.
Again, the March of 1,000 Demons. And even using nod to historical woodblock prints, specifically the one that I've always loved is the Takayashi and the Witch, or Takayashi, the Witch and the Skeleton Spectre, or Mitsukini defying the Skeleton Spectre invoked by Princess Takayasha.
Yeah. That's
such a famous painting or woodblock print. And it's used so well in this.
Yeah. I think the one thing that, like, the movie somewhat hints on, I think other Ghibli films explore it a little bit more because they're not aimed quite so heavily at kids, but people like to be scared.
Yeah. And
so it is hard for when your only defense is to be spooky to truly keep people away for very long.
Well, they even have a fox wedding in it too, which we'll talk about later this year. But the procession also kind of makes me think of, like, the Cat Returns and a bit of a... We see a little bit of that procession twisted in Satoshi Kon's Paprika.
Definitely. Oh, yeah.
But, I mean, there's all kinds of other famous yokai in it too. I mean, we see Raijin and Fujin. We have the eye butthole yokai.
Yeah, that one's weird, but, you do you. It is spooky.
Even turning human elements into the parade. I mean, it bedazzles all the people, and it scares them enough.
Yeah.
And we also... But here's the thing where we also get, like, that little interweaving of the classic yokai. But then the one master, which, by the way, I think this master is interesting because all of them are a mood when they first come to the city, all the groovy grandpas.
Yes.
But the one specifically that's the master is more fox-like than all the other yokai, or all the other tanuki.
That's true. He's definitely the most clever.
And when he dies, he's carried off by Buddha.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah, so that they do such a good job of combining the classics that we would think of with yokai and that's the side of Shintoism with, like, the little nods, because we saw the Buddhas earlier playing with the buildings.
Yeah, that's true.
Just like the little nods of, this is more heavily involved with Shintoism, which is a whole other mess of a folk religion that's not... When we talk about Shintoism, Shintoism is so, I won't say manipulatable, but it's so regional specific that it doesn't have a unifying center like a lot of Buddhism has.
True. It's a little harder to pin down.
Exactly. And I think that's why for us Americans, we find it so why we find Japanese folklore so interesting is because you have the combinations of multiple cultures influencing and just so well meshed together that they're separate at times, but at other times they're one and the same. True.
I also think that the way that the collection of creatures in this movie work well together is because it all works towards the same goal, right? Mm-hmm. The same goal is how do you, and it's not even the goal of the tanuki win, right? The movie ends with them having to decide between continue to live in the human world or trying to carve out a small portion of the human world for themselves.
Well, that's the thing, is the reason... And, I mean, they do fight back, and that's the famous scene where we get the testicle fighting. It's a good scene, too. It is.
No, it's well done.
It's a good fight scene. And it ultimately shows the plight of the tanuki is pointless because, one, again, they did all this stuff to do the demon parade and the March of the Goblins.
And it didn't work.
Well, no, it worked, but they didn't follow through because they got distracted by partying.
That's true. They sure did.
So
they're very party friendly.
Yeah, again, they're dipshits.
They are dipshits because they not only with the parade, but they had other good ideas of we should sabotage them. Mm-hmm. Constantly messing with the equipment, making people think there's a curse here. I mean, it kind of worked for a while, and then they got distracted again.
Yeah, and then the other ones accept their fate and decide to die with tanuki dignity, I guess.
Kind of. I mean, I really like how the movie ends with having a few of them finding patches of park or outskirts of town to continue to try and be tanuki in, while others are having to force to be part of the human world. Because while we want the tanuki to win, in the end, this is a Ghibli film and it's never that simple.
No. Well, and that's the thing. That's why I think Pom Poko is so heavily written off for the most part when you bring it up to Studio Ghibli fans, where it's
sure.
Oh, the one about the testicle raccoons.
It's rarely people's top one.
No, but I think what it does too is it does its commentary on environmentalism in a very smart manner.
It does.
Where it's not so much focused on the humans, whereas the tanuki's interactions with the people and how they're trying to adapt, specifically also informing us about their life cycle, where the necessity of the environment of hey, they used to be able to eat like this, one, destruction of habitat, and then on top of that, the environmental didn't allow their kids to survive as well because they didn't have food anymore. Now they're back to infighting at the beginning, as well as resorting to interacting with domesticated animals, and also very, very smartly making a commentary on the waste of human food.
Yeah, and how we just feed the McDonald's wrappers.
No, that's the thing, is we don't feed them, they take our trash.
They do, but as many people, especially if you are from bear country, you know that even if you mean to throw it away, you are inevitably feeding the wildlife.
Yeah.
And I like how this movie, especially compared to a lot of the 90s Western green movement, especially kids films went, a lot of those made human progress the true villain. Turned the pollution into an anamorphized, sexy, scary creature, had the bulldozers be the scary thing, have the dump be the scary thing where it crushes everything down into little nothingness.
Fern Gully, which check out the MicroView I wrote on that later this week.
Among several others. Honestly, it was a pretty big movement, especially 80s had quite a few that little lesser known. There's one about a troll in New York, that was terrifying, very weird. But in general, the human impact on nature is so negative that it is unquestionably the Disney-esque villain, right? Bathed in black and scary colors. Whereas this one, even though it is undoubtable that the destruction of these habitats is affecting the world, and you are sad for the tanuki because they are such happy, fun little creatures, at no point is it truly this oversimplification of progress is evil. Because even at the end, they're just remember, you were directly addressed at the end of the movie by the commentator being remember the tanuki. Please try and be kind. Do your best.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, part of that, too, is they are offered multiple ways out. I mean, the kitsune offer them, hey, follow in our footsteps. We've been through this. I mean, probably they're probably going to use the tanuki for their own means as well.
They 100% would, but like at the same time, working for a boss who understands that you need a lot of energy drinks, maybe not a bad thing.
Yeah, well, I mean, the tanuki turned to the old ways, and like with the found footage show and the tanuki statue tying into like the classic culture of like, here's this statue. Oh, they aren't showing themselves as the actual animal. They're showing themselves as the mythology or the mythology that people would think of. And on top of that, like the thing with it too is it's an interesting way of trying to convey or communicate between two sides that can't understand each other, because when the communication fails, violence ensues.
Very true. I also think that this movie handles the call to action in an interesting way. Even though we are like directly addressed beginning and end, like, hey, remember, all of this is happening because you, a human, has to live somewhere. But instead of a lot of other movies, especially, honestly, a lot of kids' movies too, do the idea of like, well, this is your fault. And thus the audience member comes away feeling guilty in some way of something they have done. And so that is the call to action. You feel guilty about it, do something about it. Whereas this one, even though there is a little bit of guilt there, the real call is don't forget pity. And I think, honestly, it is a much kinder and easier message to get across because it's something that I think is much more memorable. Yeah,
well, it's like in some of the landscape classes I took, and I full-heartedly believe in this stuff too, is when we design our landscapes for our backyards and front yards, a lot of times we just choose something that's ornamental and looks good, and we're not even trying to consider giving back to nature. Like my parents' backyard, I think, is a great example of that, where they've planted stuff that birds use as nests, and there's also berries that other animals can eat that we can't eat, but they can.
Sure.
And on top of that, like I was at my parents' place over the 4th of July, and you know when someone has a great backyard, when the rabbits can spread out like Superman and just not have to worry about...
Oh, yes. They're very cute.
Yeah. I think we were missing that a lot in especially our culture of manicured lawns, where we want that pristine looking organized yard when that's not how nature is. And I think that's what Pom Poko really does well, is that nothing is really organized that well within nature that everything can survive well together.
True. I also think this movie does a great job of balancing what... there is no perfection shown. Even the beginning, when they have all of their space, there is still problems in nature. Like, they still fight. There's still problems with getting enough food or having enough territory. Because I think it's important to show the imperfection, because this movie, by the time this came out, Ghibli was by no means a small production. They knew this was going to be international.
I mean, we're still a few years out from Princess Mononoke. I think probably like their biggest movie before that, at least for us, was Kiki's Delivery Service and maybe My Neighbor Totoro.
My Neighbor Totoro definitely was like the one that got us here, because I think it won a few awards for music. Poco Rosso also made a pretty big wave at the very beginning, but general American audiences wouldn't truly know Ghibli as a name until Spirited Away, which won several Oscars.
And for most of us, that was our introduction to Spirited Away. I mean, it came out in 2001 when... God, I was in like 7th or 8th grade at that point. So
exactly.
Starting to understand anime a little bit more than, oh, it's a cutesy little film.
For sure. But by the time Pom Poko came out, they knew that they had something. They knew they were going to be international. They had already been international for several of these films. So with that knowledge, knowing that the way they portray Japanese struggle with balancing this new green initiative and like how they're going to continue that forward, what that green movement looks like, and how to address it to children, it couldn't be so hyper specifically Japanese that it wouldn't hit other audiences. And I think that works really well, because the only part that the tanuki really interact with is the construction zone, which pretty bare bones and honestly pretty universal. Big construction equipment looks about the same just about everywhere you go. And then deep city, which is easy to like compare to other cities. Yeah,
or nature. It's not like with the 4Kids translations of Pokemon where they felt the need to translate rice balls to donuts, which I always, as a kid, wondered how they got the jelly to look like that in a donut.
True. Honestly, there was a lot of things that got retranslated either for censorship or because they thought an American audience wouldn't understand. And so I appreciate that they didn't show like a more suburban neighborhood, because while it is recognizable as a neighborhood, I think a lot of American kids or Canadian kids would see that and it looks different, especially, or like an English kid, that those houses look different. They have different sorts of yards. You have the different closeness. They look significantly different. And so it'd be easy to say, well, I have a big backyard. Problem solved. Check. As opposed to just leaving it more vague and letting it continue to be like, oh, yeah, it is, we are still like encroaching on someone else's land. How can I change that, or how can I help?
Well, and I also wonder if maybe the icon that Hayao Miyazaki became, or the face he became of Studio Ghibli, kind of overshadowed Isao Takahata's roles to us in the US, or his movies to us. Because usually that's the thing with some of these is it's not so much about who's going to be voicing it, it's who's directing. And that's the big thing with anime too, is like it's who's directing this movie. It's not who's going to be acting in it. It's what studio is going to be doing it and what director within that studio is going to be doing it. And it's probably Miyazaki is part of the issue that why Takahata never really got as much as a foothold in our consciousness of what Studio Ghibli was until more recently. I mean, hell, look at their early films before the Studio Ghibli. Miyazaki did Nausicaa and the Valley of the Wind, Castle in the Sky, My Neighbor Totoro, Kiki's Delivery Service, Porco Rosso, whereas Takahata only did Grave of the Fireflies. Very good, but fucking depressing.
Very.
And Only Yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, this was only his third movie with the studio, but honestly, all three strong. He just started off with a very depressing one, and one that came out, I think, honestly, a little bit too close to Kiki's, and then followed up very closely with Porco Rosso, which was also very popular. So, like, timing-wise, unfortunately, the guy just didn't have it. I also think part of it, too, has to do with how it was advertised here in America. It was not well known that Ghibli was with anyone directing and writing other than Miyazaki.
Exactly. And that's my point is, I think for a while, a lot of us before, like, the internet was really a big thing, or we could easily go, or I mean, we could easily go to IMDb, but we never did. True. We just assumed everything that came out of Studio Ghibli was Miyazaki.
Well, and Disney's done this thing too, and honestly, part of it was because of Disney. Disney is very specific with branding, and they fuck a lot of people over.
Also, we gotta remember at that time, Disney was the only people localizing Studio Ghibli movies.
They sure were, which is why a lot of the voice actors are Disney names. Not necessarily a bad thing, I think a lot of them do a good job, but Disney likes putting the biggest name on front, and especially if it goes well with their own branding, they like to be themselves on the front, which is also why a lot of people thought these were Disney films for a hot second, because the Disney brand was on some of the early DVD boxes.
Yeah. Well,
and I see how it's confusing, especially if Pom Poko was your first one. This one's weird, but with a stretch, sure.
Well, and I think there's also something with this movie where, yeah, the tanuki testicle transformation is a little strange, but so's a lot of other folklore. I mean,
sure. There's a lot of children eating in Western folklore, so, like, I can't complain too much. There's no children eating in this one. Yeah, I mean, it's just an aspect that I think maybe we weren't ready for at that time as pasty white I don't think
kids.
I think in the 90s, unfortunately, we weren't quite ready. I do think now most people, like, have Google readily accessible enough to be able to, like, quickly figure out the answer to their question, hopefully, and, like, understand, like, even the smallest amount of backlore that the movie kind of hints at, but you could fill in your own understanding with.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, because if you type in tanuki nowadays, as opposed to getting a long Wikipedia article about, like, reading all the history and the information, now you just get images of the statues that are popular around towns and shops.
Yeah.
And so you can very easily see, like, oh, that's just what the thing looks like.
Yeah, well, we also have to consider that probably for the most part, our exposure to this kind of stuff, unless your family was really into films and knew Kurosawa's works, or I can't remember if Criterion was around at this point. They might have been around. It might be Channel Z at that point.
Yeah.
But that was really only in California too. But, like, our exposure was either old Godzilla movies,
true,
or Kung Fu theater, because I would watch that kind of stuff with my dad as a kid in the morning. That was my exposure to that stuff early on. But that, again, that you get it heavily dubbed, heavily edited.
Very heavily edited. I mean, I remember watching Sailor Moon around this time and finding out years later that it was vastly changed from the version I knew.
Hell, I didn't know Pokemon was Japanese. I'm just like, oh, it's cartoons.
Yeah, I think a lot of us did for a long time. And Pom Poko came out at kind of a weird time where if you were the weird kid who liked anime, you at least knew kind of roughly. You definitely didn't Google, though.
No.
I think nowadays it's such a mainstream topic. I think people are so familiar with Naruto that, like, honestly, it bridges... I know it's stupid, but it does bridge a lot of gaps in, like, a very dumb and, like, low-level way because it's changed it for its own use. Not a bad thing, but it at least opens the door for a lot of people. Even if you're not nerdy, you've at least kind of sort of have an in. Yeah. And so, like, you at least know how to start the conversation or Google process.
Well, it's also a gateway into just things in general, because I think with Pom Poko, the biggest gateway and why it works so well as viewing it from a modern viewpoint is that it's about nature. At its core, it's not about the tanuki, it's about nature and our relationship with the animals. True. Explored via the tanuki. I mean, we talk about, like, their ending where it's like, oh, be nice to the tanuki and don't forget them. And that's interesting, too, because, like, the part right before that, they do their last little bit of magic to remind the humans that, hey, you used to be part of this.
Yeah, that's true. They very much embody the same place that fairies do in Western, like, green storytelling. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It's just a slightly different one.
No, exactly. I mean, that even, the one thing I do like about that last image that they have to show the people is that it's the 4 seasons as well.
Yeah, no, honestly, despite having all of the weirdness, visually, this is one of Ghibli's more stunning looking pieces. There's a lot of detail. There's a lot of background characters all drawn really well. The story is long enough to, like, insert a bunch of stuff. It's very fun to watch, even if you've watched it before and you were like, it's not my favorite Ghibli film. Go back and rewatch it, because I think you'll be surprised how beautiful it is. Yeah,
it's easy, and I think part of it too is it's, like I said before, it's easy to set it aside as fighting ball raccoon dogs.
It is.
But the big thing with it too is I also think it's maybe part of what makes it less memorable for some is that it is a tad heavy-handed in its end message, because, hey, this is the tanuki. Don't forget them. Hey, this is part of nature. Same with the very beginning of the movie, where it's a little heavy-handed. And maybe that's just because it's a little imbalanced in between, where it starts off as kind of a documentary, then gets into, like, its little fantasy world, and then kind of ends in that documentary format.
Sure. Out of Ghibli's repertoire of storytelling, it is not the cleanest.
No.
But visually, it is one of, I think, the prettier ones. I think the only thing that people don't remember about it is because it's missing a lot of the, like, big beauties. Like, Princess Mononoke has the moon forest creature, which stunning, breathtaking, along with giant wolves. You know, there's no big ocean, there's no big ocean goddess. And a lot of browns, a lot of raccoons, but really well done browns and raccoons. I think it's really pretty. The music is, of course, great and fantastic, but it's
goofy.
But at no point is it the stunning soundtracks that we've come to know from a lot of the composers from Ghibli.
Composed by a Japanese group called Shang Shang Typhoon. That is a dope band name.
It is a dope band name. I know some of the songs from this are popular enough to make it into, like, the list of Ghibli sounds and soundtracks and sheet music. I know I have one of them. I think the main theme is part of the collection. So yeah, it is by no means the greatest piece. However, I don't think it gets enough credit. I do think a lot of people just remember it as the weird raccoon ball movie and watched it maybe once and haven't revisited it. It's fantastic. It's definitely worth, like, a full enjoyment.
Yeah, I full-heartedly agree. I'm glad we went back and chose this one to start.
Yes.
Just because it is on the lighter side, but at the same time, if you really wanted to do a deep dive, I feel you really, really could with this one, even though it's one of the lesser appreciated Studio Ghibli movies.
You totally could. There's a lot that I left out because, honestly, while very fascinating, it's not necessary to enjoy the movie about the different ways Japan was trying to get people into the forest and into nature during the 80s and the 90s. One of my favorite ones that I came across was this idea of forest bathing was popular, which is the idea of being surrounded by the trees.
Just going in the fucking forest.
It is just going in the fucking forest.
It's a fucking stupid name.
But it was given a branding and, like, a whole bunch of advertisement, and it wasn't the only, like, thing going for it. And so I think this movie, like, has a lot of fun that you can have with researching it if you want, not just from the Tanuki side, but from how Japan's constant need for growth and improvement had to be balanced at some point with their same drive but for nature, and they took that same energy of growth and put it directly into their forest, and I think it's a very fascinating if anyone felt like Googling.
Yeah, hell, I mean, you can easily go down a rabbit hole with just the demon parade itself.
Oh,
trying
for
to
sure.
pick out all the yokai.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a bunch of other like little side characters that are based off of different either folk writers or folk creators. They make very quick little brief like nods to who they're supposed to be, which is fun. I think this is a great movie, and I'm honestly a little sad that it's not on more people's top 3.
Yeah. So, Chris, rent, buy, streamer, decline that we ever watched Pom Poko despite having an audio recording of us watching it.
This is honestly the first Ghibli film I ever bought, despite it not being my favorite. I bought it because it was one of the ones I hadn't seen yet, and I have never regretted owning it. It is one I regularly pull out, and I rewatch it as often as I can.
Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I think I bought it because I had I'd only seen the bits of the raccoon ball fighting.
Yeah.
And I think that is a shame because the movie is such a good,
it's such a good
little
movie.
flick that I don't know. I love this movie, and I wholeheartedly think everyone should buy it. It's not one of those Ghibli films where I'm like, maybe buy it if you really like it, or...
Sure. No, the only downside to this one is because it is not one of the, honestly, a lot of people's top 5. It does not come with a lot of the extra stuff that I usually associate with owning a Ghibli DVD. No. Usually, even if you buy one of the lesser ones, it comes with an interview or some behind-the-scenes stills or some how-tos. I think they've reused that interview with Miyazaki's art process like 1,000 times now.
Yeah.
But, like, honestly, that's what I expect when I buy a film labeled Ghibli. You're not going to get that with this one. It's very limited on what it has. I think the super duper collector's edition, the beautiful like 10 version, if you can get your hands on it, has a little tiny bit more.
They don't. I have a couple copies where I've had the 10 version and I have the non-tin version.
Yeah,
it's
nothing more.
It's the exact same thing. It's just a marketing thing for steelbooks, and honestly, their steelbooks are some of the lesser steelbooks because...
I was going to say, I've had other steelbooks and they come with at least a booklet.
Well, even then, like, I buy steelbooks because I like the artwork on it. This one,
it's
all Studio Ghibli's steelbooks are just like a single image and then the title.
I mean, if you already have the collection, continue on. But yeah, there's not like a special version that I recommend, unlike some of the other Ghibli films, which I do have a version I recommend buying. This one, just find one at the thrift store. It's very good.
Exactly. But I'm glad this is our start to pre-gaming Folktober.
I am too, because honestly, when people say yokai, the scene of them like dancing through the streets, that's what I always imagine. And so I'm glad we got to talk about one of my favorites.
Well, exactly. And we do get to kick off the pre-game with our first deep dive with another Isao Takahata movie, so...
Very true.
Yeah, look forward to that. Anywho, this has been the Good, the Bad, and the Weird podcast MicroViews.
Thanks for listening.
Peace! Thank you for stopping by this here town of the good, the bad, and the weird. We appreciate your listenership, and if you want more of our takes in your life, feel free to check us out on social media at The Good, the Bad, and the Weird Podcast, or TGTBTW for short. As well, if we missed a fact, your favorite part of a movie, or just have a suggestion and want to reach out and say howdy, feel free to email us at tgtbtwpodcast@gmail.com. And feel free to join our Discord at The Good, the Bad, and the Weird Podcast, where we talk about movies, just share random banter here and there. And always, check out our podcasters, streamers, or any other content creator we shout out in our episodes. We really appreciate it. And as always, thank you for listening. Peace!